What's going on there, Workforce? Chris here with Work to Game, and today I'm actually going to be doing the first of what may end up being several translation guides from World of Warcraft to Final Fantasy XIV and back. Now, these games are very different, and so some of these things, you may see the exact same term used in both games, even though it means something different. Other times you may see totally different terms that mean almost the same thing, and sometimes you actually see a concept that in one game is already well fleshed out and is totally there, and in the other game there just isn't anything parallel. So I'm going to go over a bunch of these because I know in the comments section on some of our videos or any forums you read, you may see people coming from one game or coming from one background, and they say something and you're not exactly sure what they mean. So let's dive in. Now I have both games running side by side on my desktop, so ignore resolution, ignore settings. This is really just so that I can jump back and forth seamlessly while I talk about these, so that I'm recording them at exactly the same time. And keep in mind that when I'm playing WoW, I play heavily with add-ons, and when I'm playing Final Fantasy, this is actually the PS4 client going through a capture card. So really this is just to show game concepts, and where we're starting out here is actually with the character creation screen. Now one of the biggest differences you'll notice is that I'm not a horribly endgame driven active top-end character in either of these games. I'm kind of on the higher end of, I guess, casual, and I have multiple characters on the WoW side and only one character on the Final Fantasy side, and this is pretty typical. It's very easy to have multiple characters in World of Warcraft if you choose to explore other classes, as opposed to in Final Fantasy, all of your classes exist on one character. And so outside of RP, or people who want to play heavily on the market board, or they want to be, you know, not have to deal with weekly lockouts, which are character wide when you get into endgame, and they want to be able to run that with multiple groups because they have multiple groups of friends, really you do see a typical player in Final Fantasy running with just one character. Now, oftentimes your character in WoW is called Toon, but they are still called character. You notice it's a character creation, and it's new character over here. Now, if you go into the character creation screen, you will notice that these characters have different roles. Ranged or melee damage, healer or range damage, and that is because a character in World of Warcraft has multiple specializations. They actually call these specs, and this is what allows you to get a variety of gameplay out of a single character. And so even when you just compare the total number of classes here without roles, it looks very comparable to the Final Fantasy side, where we can say create a new character, and you really don't see any of that because this one character is going to have access to all of the classes in the game. The difference here is that while Final Fantasy has been very, very good about adding classes much more often than WoW's pattern of adding a class every other expansion, you have a multiplier here because World of Warcraft has chosen to embrace this specs, and so it's this number times the number of specs, and some classes like Druid, for example, actually have 4 different specs, so you have an enormous amount of variety when you're comparing these two games. Now when comparing these jobs and specs, once again, this is not necessarily a video about comparing the games, it's about translating. You will see a difference in terms, most notably in my opinion, on tanks. So I have my warrior from Final Fantasy, and I have a brewmaster tank over here on monk, and the big thing is going to be that tanks typically in WoW refer to it as threat generation, and over on the Final Fantasy side you'll see a lot of documentation on enmity. It is exactly the same thing. An average player will sometimes call this hate or aggro. Any number of games have called it any number of things over the years, and because we don't all just play one game our whole life, you've seen these terms go across, but if one of them doesn't make sense to you, that's what that is. One of the other big differences in this game is the way you handle professions. Now, if I jump over to the Final Fantasy thing here, and I have 2 mice, so that's going to be confusing, you have all of these different jobs. And as I said earlier, I do not have all mine maxed, but then you jump over to professions, which are disciples of the hand and disciples of the land. Hand being crafters, land being gatherers. But these are actually totally different classes. So if I jump over to my fisher, it changes my gear, it changes my level, it changes everything. The big thing over here is when you jump onto World of Warcraft, if I actually go to my spell books and abilities, I have professions of which I can only have 2. Now that includes gathering and crafting. Now you have secondary professions, and every single character in World of Warcraft has access to these. So that's going to be first aid, which we believe is going under a major transformation going into Battle for Azeroth, possibly just disappearing altogether, being absorbed by tailoring. There's a lot of speculation on exactly what that's going to shape up to be as we look at the beta and we assume that we know. The second is going to be down here, as you'll notice, cooking. Over here, that's actually going to be directly parallel to culinarian. So while there is no first aid, there is culinary culinarian. Now, archaeology over here is actually just something that encourages you to go out in the world and discover treasure. And so I would most liken that to the treasure map system in Final Fantasy, even though that's not a profession, it is just something done very differently, and you gain those treasure maps through your gatherers. Now, fishing is fishing, but these fishing systems could not be more different, and I hope to one day have the chance to, on my primary fisher on World of Warcraft and my primary fisher over here on Final Fantasy, make a video specifically about that, because they are very, very different. Now, as we move into the rest of the professions that are on World of Warcraft, these can also be things like skinning. Over on Final Fantasy, you get all of your furs and stuff just from killing things. There is no skinning profession. Mining is mining, though keep in mind in World of Warcraft, if we actually jump out to the world and mine, this is mining in World of Warcraft. I'm going to go to a node on a character in my battle class. It's going to ask me if I want to open this add-on, and I don't. And I simply right-click. It casts. Whether or not it levels, you'll see that this is actually level gray mining. You can tell by the color of the word, and that is because I'm already past Draenor level mining on this character, and this is in a Draenor zone, and I'm going to just gather that. And that's it. That's the whole system. It really is that simple. And so if I hop to my professions, you'll see I have mining already capped at 700. I need to push this character up to 800 to get into Legion stuff, and that's really, that's the end of that. There isn't any more depth. Now let's jump over to Final Fantasy. Now I've come to a nice low-level node here, and you'll notice on the minimap there's many nodes, and that's because these are going to be in a cluster, and every time I harvest one, it's going to spawn a different one. Now this percentage, when you get into actually your level range, will vary, and you have all these skills down here to encourage finding high-quality ingredients versus not, finding, finding the success rate, increasing the length of anything. It's a huge complex system, and so that one has now disappeared, and I can run over here and I can grab one of these other ones. I also have to worry about, because I'm not a battle class, I may have to actually stealth as I get into higher level zones. I wouldn't have to worry about with this guy, and that's what allows me to not be attacked, because I really don't have the ability to defend myself. And so this is just a totally different, much more in-depth system, and this is just a point, not to which game is necessarily better, but just to say that even when there's a direct translation, such as mining equals mining, that both of these games can be drastically different. And so I can go ahead and finish this one up and talk about the fact that Botany is going to be the same way. Botany is the Final Fantasy, instead of mining, you have botany over here, and that is actually going to be the equivalent of herbalism over on the World of Warcraft side. Now, as we move through the rest of kind of what these are, you move into your crafters. Now, your crafters in Final Fantasy are going to be much more complex. Disciple of Hand, you have all these different crafters, and when it comes to working with pieces of gear, you may need the specific crafter for that specific piece of gear, and so there is a much more in-depth system on the Final Fantasy side of things, especially when you're comparing it to Legion, the most recent expansion, where crafting kind of seems to have taken a little bit of a backseat, just in my personal opinion. Now, blacksmithing is blacksmithing, but on the Final Fantasy side, you're actually going to split apart the weapons and the armor side into blacksmith and armorer. Now, when you move over to leatherworking in World of Warcraft, that is going to be your leatherworker here in Final Fantasy, but keep in mind that on the WoW side of things, when you get into higher level characters, you actually have characters that move over to wearing mail, and that is handled by the leatherworker on WoW, and that is actually going to kind of push you back into armor over here. Now, tailoring is going to be your weaver. That makes sense. Engineer is actually kind of handling trinkets and things like that, so I would say the closest is going to be your goldsmith. And when you compare alchemy, that is going to be your alchemist. So a lot of it seems to be directly parallel. Now, some of the professions that you don't really see here are inscription, jewel crafting, enchanting over on the World of Warcraft side, and that is actually going to be taken up by this descent skill down at the bottom. That's going to be your ability to take apart items, and convert, which is actually another way of kind of taking apart items, and then actually the ability to modify items to positively benefit them, right? Enchanting and jewel crafting, that's actually going to be handled by the materia system, which is just something totally different. And so if we actually jump over to my warrior here, you can actually go and see in my slots, I have these slots where I've modified the stats with kind of different grade 6s, and this isn't necessarily optimal. I have some missing and things like that, and that's a lot like when you see somebody who maybe doesn't have their gear fully enchanted. They haven't really, and so it's the exact same. It's that ability to take a piece of gear and improve it if you so choose to put the money into that class or that piece of gear. Now, one of the big things is you'll notice that my tank here looks like a pig. It's kind of goofy. It's fantastic. That is not what this armor looks like. That is because I have glamoured it. Now, glamour is going to be handled in a glamour dresser, and so let me go ahead and take us to one of those. Now, while that character makes its way to a dresser, I am going to be over here on the World of Warcraft thing showing you that this is a very Diablo 3, not unexpected from Blizzard. This is how they handle transmog. Now, you can only do it from certain areas, so you know there is a mount that actually has the ability to interact with this, so it's a lot like the fact that that character needs to go to an inn, and that's going to be what allows you to interact with this. But you store every appearance you've ever found, and so there are tons of these, and each and every class has access to different ones. Now, if you find like a leather chest piece and it doesn't say it has to be worn by a certain class, any other class I have that's a leather chest piece would also have access to that. So it has stored pages and pages of these, and even when you get into the ones I don't have, it tells me where to go get them. Now, this screen also handles things like heirloom items, which is kind of equivalent to the XP buff that you get in Final Fantasy when you have a higher level character than the job you're leveling. And then toy box and pet journals. Pet journals is where you keep your battle pets, which is going to be the equivalent of the minion system, though the battle pet game is a lot different, a lot closer to Pokemon than Lords of Verminion, which is the minion game over on the Final Fantasy side of things. And then you keep all your mounts here as well. So there is a ton of differences between this, but that is actually going to be where you keep that transmog. Now let's jump over to Final Fantasy. Now, as of the time of this recording, Legion is winding down, preparing for Battle for Azeroth, so a lot of these systems are changing. That being said, we're in the middle of an expansion in Final Fantasy, and actually the Glamour system is one of the systems that's undergoing major changes. But for now, let's just show you a Glamour chest dresser, and you have the ability to kind of pick things in your inventory and modify them. You can actually edit Glamour plates. The nice thing about a plate is I've created a pig plate, and it only takes these 2 pieces, and then I can actually apply that from anywhere out in the world once I've made these plates. And I can actually, this pig doesn't come in metallic blue. I dyed it metallic blue and then made that part of the plate. And so there's a lot of different abilities and strengths and weaknesses with this system, but that is what glamour versus transmog means. Now, I am in a major city right now. Those are both kind of referred to as capitals, but this also happens to be the city that is the location of my grand company. There are 3 grand companies, one for each of the 3 main capital cities at the time of launch, and mine is the Twin Adders. So if I leave this in, I can actually head over to that area, and it has access to its own little like squadrons that I can send out on missions, which between squadrons and ventures, that's probably the closest to like the order hall and garrison system. Now, unfortunately, in capital cities, I can't mount because these kind of came from when the game first launched without flying. So I would hope through like a Cataclysm type expansion or something like that, that they would add flying to these zones. But for now, we're kind of just stuck running by foot with my sprint. And you actually also, from the standpoint of grand companies, have free companies, which is going to be your guilds. Now, we have link shells, which is kind of our chat things, and actually I think BFA is going to have the chat channels is going to very much mimic the way link shells already work here. And so this is my grand company area, the Twin Adders. In my opinion, the best of the 3. Of course, you're welcome to your own. And these are going to give you all sorts of different ways to interact with the game, new and differently, as opposed to in World of Warcraft, the most equivalent thing is kind of your factions, your alliance versus your horde. Now, unlike that, it's much harder to change between those two. You can't do it for free. You have to literally switch over to the other. And on the Final Fantasy side of things, all the characters can interact with each other regardless of Grand Company. It is going to determine things like where you PvP, but they've actually even lifted that restriction in their own unique way. One of the benefits of being part of a free company or being an individual player is going to be housing. So let me jump over to my house, and this is actually a house owned by my guild. Now, my free company. But you can also have personal housing, and housing is something that there is not a parallel in World of Warcraft. That's just something that's totally different. Now, one of the things that we've seen added to Final Fantasy very, very recently is the ability to level boost or story skip. That is actually the character boost that you can do over on World of Warcraft. So while that house loads, let me go ahead and jump over to that. And Blizzard actually handles everything through the the Blizzard app, which is very easy to use, or battle.net, and that is actually the equivalent of the Mog Station and the Lodestone. And so I have this shop in the actual game, and I can actually go here and I can even buy things like my character boost, which is kind of your level boost potion. They have similar restrictions. I've actually done a whole video kind of comparing these, but ultimately those are the translations there. And you have a lot of things other than this that largely overlap in games. Both games have an achievement system. Both games have mounts. Both games have titles. Both games have reputations and dailies. Now, one of the big differences there is actually, let me jump back in and we're going to be talking about world quests. Let me show you this house real quick. Now, this is my free company house. If we go inside, it has multiple stories. I can have a room in it that's personal. It has gardening, which we saw kind of in Mist of Pandaria. And this is actually where I can even get to my market board, which is the equivalent of the auction house. That's where I can actually spend my gil, which is the equivalent of gold. If I click on this, I can actually open up my currencies tab, and just like World of Warcraft, there is a whole ridiculous number of other currencies and things that I can store and earn and spend. And so there's a lot of things that are similar. I actually have reputation with my dailies, which is done by your beast tribes, and beast tribes are something that's done out in the world. It's a lot different than the modern system of world quests over in World of Warcraft, and it's a lot closer to the old system, the way we got things like the dragon mounts and things like that back in the day. Now, what we have over here in World of Warcraft is all the world quests that are available to me, because I haven't been on this character in a while, so they're all up for me. And these are actually quests that pop up, and they're on timers, and if I do enough, I can actually get these different rewards, and that is actually the closest to the fate system in Final Fantasy. These little zones out in the world that you actually level sync to, and you can do them with other players, whether or not you're kind of in a party with them, and you achieve different goals, very similar goals. Slay 3 of the guys, defend the thing, it's all very, very similar. But this gives them a chance to kind of recycle different quests that maybe would have been there along the way as you leveled through these zones. And it's something that I'd love to see the Fate system kind of make a Final Fantasy translated version more directly of, to encourage us to use those fates, because this also includes things like world bosses. And when you get out into killing world bosses, not to mention all the rare spawns that are out there, that is actually the most equivalent to kind of Diadem or Eureka, but it's actually out in the world. But that's kind of similar. When you hear people saying Eureka and Diadem, they're referring to a zone where we go and we're part of these huge groups killing these massive monsters for loot that we're going to need to do over and over and over in order to progress. Now, as I've moved around in World of Warcraft here, I actually have been using kind of my different hearthstones, and I can use flight paths, and I can even go through all these different kind of portals and stuff out in the world, and that's how you get around. Now, when we jump over to Final Fantasy here, I'm standing next to a giant aetheryte crystal, and so it's a much, I guess, more direct system. And so if we actually open up this here, I have all these different things. I can favorite a destination to make it cheaper, but most of things are done through aetheryte systems. There are chocobos that you can take place to place, like the flight path system, but most people don't do that. And I'm actually at one of those beast tribes, the kind of equivalent to world quests. And so this one here I actually had to change in my Fisher, because this is one of the newest beast tribes, and this actually allows me to level up my crafters and gatherers. And so because they've chosen to embrace that kind of daily system, they have kind of gone in a direction that I haven't really seen World of Warcraft go, at least recently. They've had some different things done in dailies over the years. Burning Crusade, I think, really tried to push the envelope with that. And so these systems have been explored in different ways, and so I'm picking up my dailies here, and I can actually knock these out on my Fisher, or I could knock them out on a crafter. It doesn't really matter, and I'm gaining rep with the Namatsu, which will give me an ability to get their own unique mount and kind of all these different things, much like you'd see a reputation gain in World of Warcraft. Now, a lot of the reasons you do world quests and stuff in WoW is because you need artifact power, and you use artifact power to level up your artifact weapons. Your artifact weapons are tied to each of your specs, your jobs, and it's a lot like the relic weapon system. Now in BFA we're actually moving to neck pieces, and in Stormblood we're seeing right now that they're actually trying relic armor in addition to relic weapons, but ultimately it's a piece of gear that, rather than throwing out for another piece of gear, both games are choosing to have a leveling and progression system tied to it. And speaking of items that take up inventory, over here in Final Fantasy, standing next to that market board, that auction house, the way I actually handle all my inventory is rather than a bank, I have these different retainers. And the retainers can store things. They're what actually allow me to list things. I can actually send them out on missions. So my squadrons work a little different than this, but they also go out on missions, and that's the equivalent of my order hall, which is where I am in World of Warcraft right now. And so the order hall garrison system is kind of up right here, and then I of course have add-ons and stuff modifying a lot of this, but I can send them out on missions, but the rewards tend to be much greater, and we expect to see that change a lot with BFA. The garrison system from Draenor was very different than the one from Legion, while there were some kind of hangover things, and the interface in general is just very different. You'll see a lot of the same tabs called something different, like Spellbook and Abilities here is actually going to be called the Journal over on the Final Fantasy side. So the quest is actually going to be called Journal, but the Spellbook and Abilities is going to be called your Actions and Traits. And so if we open this up, depending on the kind of the class you are, you actually have role abilities that are kind of shared per your role. Those used to be cross-class skills, and so here's the things that are to my class, and here's the things to my job. Everybody plays as a job now since they've kind of gotten away from the class system, and so these are all my different things. Now macros work a lot of the same ways, but your stats and attributes are actually one of the biggest differences in the way these characters feel. You know, Final Fantasy runs a lot more on an actual kind of, I guess, D&D type system with the way they're named, and so let's kind of compare these directly. Now, pulling these up side by side, HP is HP, strength is strength, int is int, though it gets broken down a little bit further on the Final Fantasy side, but agility is probably closest to dexterity, and so you're going to see, you know, different classes in that. Stamina is probably closest to vitality. Mana is actually kind of a fixed amount that gets modified from there in World of Warcraft, and that's actually going to be managed by your piety over on the Final Fantasy side. And then you have mind, which is still just another part of int over on the WoW side. And when we start to get into class-specific things, different classes have, you know, a different form of kind of mana. This monks here run on energy, and over on the Final Fantasy side, I can actually change classes several times here. And so I can change over to Black Mage, and I can change over to Red Mage, and I can change to Paladin, and I can change to Warrior, and you always have those same three bars, HP, MP, TP. And so that's a little different when you start to compare things like runic power and mana and energy. And so it's a lot more broken down by class over on the World of Warcraft side. Now, crit strike is going to be crit hit. Armor and versatility is going to be determination and defense. Hit rating, well, you kind of always hit now. Hit rating's largely been lifted in World of Warcraft, and that's going to be your direct hit over on the Final Fantasy side. Resistances and versus kind of magical defense on the Final Fantasy side, and then Final Fantasy's tenacity is actually going to kind of probably best be drawn with block, dodge, versatility. Now, none of these are direct parallels, and keep in mind that the way you gear for them and the level of control you have over them is very, very different. Your primary stat, for example, in World of Warcraft largely drives your attack power, and so over on the Final Fantasy side, you're going to be looking at attack power, spell power, you know, all these things, but really the word that they use most common when people are referring to talking about breaking down specs and comparing rotations is potency. And so potency is kind of this thing that appears on all your skills that tells you how hard does it hit. And so if I mouse over one of these, you can kind of see, if I jump over to one of my abilities that actually hits hard, you can see delivers an attack with a potency of 160. And so that's going to be how you kind of break that down. And over on the WoW side, you're looking more at an attack power and a spell power type stat. Now, WoW used to have a stat, Resilience, that was in PvP. PvP is calculated a little bit differently now. And over on the Final Fantasy side, you're going to be looking at morale for that. And PvP is one of the areas that these games are still very, very, very different. So if I pull up my group finder here in World of Warcraft, and I pull up my duty finder here in Final Fantasy, those are actually kind of the same screen. And so we can compare a couple of key differences here. Your raid that's available to the general public is going to be your 24-man Alliance raid on the Final Fantasy side. And that's going to be 3 different groups of 8, and they get broken apart for different things. And actually on the WoW side, your LFRs kind of handle that. You're looking for raid. Raid scaling is an interesting concept where they actually allow you to kind of bring different amounts of people between like 10 and 20, and the raid will scale. But where you really get into your end game, the people who are really generally looking for translations and trying to either explain why they think their game is better, or why they think their game could improve, or just having a conversation with somebody from the other game, is you're talking about out kind of those mythics, those hard modes over on WoW, and that's actually going to get you up into your ultimate extreme, your savage. The keyword savage is kind of the most common over here on Final Fantasy. And so if we actually go to kind of high-end duty, I do have two mice here. You know, so this is going to be where you start to get into savage trials and progressing through this. And so that's going to be very, very different. One of the big differences in the way a lot of these dungeons feel is the size of the party. And so in World of Warcraft, you are dealing with a 5-man, and in Final Fantasy, you're dealing with a 4-man. And so just the general sizes of these groups, the way they feel, the ratio of tanks to healers to DPS feels a lot different, not to mention just the way they handle the classes, the way they handle rotations. Keep in mind, Final Fantasy is a game that, while I play with keyboard and mouse, Brian plays with controller. He actually plays on a PC with controller, and I play with a keyboard and mouse on a PS4. And World of Warcraft doesn't have console support. It doesn't really have controller support, definitely not native. There's an add-on out there, but it's not the same as having native support. And so there's a big difference in the way these feel, and the global cooldown, for example, is much longer in Final Fantasy. So just the pacing in general is a lot more geared towards a set of players that are cross-platform on Final Fantasy versus, you know, kind of get your computer up to speed or get out over on World of Warcraft. Now, when we talk about this in-game content, there's a lot of things that are different in the way raids work. And so if we talk about kind of World of Warcraft over here, when we go into any number of these raids over here, you're actually going to see people popping Bloodlust, which is on a cooldown. That's what it's typically referred to as heroism. There's a lot of different abilities that trigger this cooldown that everybody is affected by if you've had your kind of spell power, your attack power modified by this. They also have a limit on the number of combat raises you can do in these raids. There are these trinkets for high-end raiders, your Pantheon trinket, your Savage Hallows, things like that, that actually kind of trigger. And so that is how a group kind of gains the power to overcome an obstacle that typically their class wasn't designed to do. Now, the way that works in Final Fantasy, is actually going to be your limit break bar. And so if we open up our kind of actions and traits here, every single character has access to a limit break. Now, this is going to be done by role. And so if, for example, you have a level 3 limit break available to the whole group and a healer does that, that's going to be your mass res top the party off. You can be rezzed over and over and over in Final Fantasy, but there's kind of a res penalty to that. So somebody's getting kind of a res sickness, for lack of a translation, that World of Warcraft term coming in, that's going to keep that from being effective. You really don't want to die. It's very hard on your healers. It's not a strong party member that comes back, especially when you start to talk about needing multiple reses. And so there is a huge difference in the way a progression raid feels in these two games. Gearing optimization is just something that's very different. Best in slot is a term used in both games, and actually in Final Fantasy, if we just open up our character screen here, you don't see a trinket slot. You don't have that kind of really floater piece of gear that has on-use abilities, proc abilities, things like that. And a lot more of this is really just straight up stats. You'll notice that this gear is shared across all tanks: Gladiator, Marauder, Paladin, Warrior, and Dark Knight. And so this is actually shared across all the tanks, and then our weapons are unique to the class. And in Final Fantasy that works. Your materia is where you have the most flex. If we jump over to the World of Warcraft side, you see that you have these trinkets. And so I actually have a legendary trinket. I can only have one legendary kind of thing equipped over here. I can't, so if I got a second legendary trinket, I couldn't equip it without unequipping this one. And you notice our eye levels are drastically different, but there's a squish coming in World of Warcraft because this has gotten a little out of hand with item level 1000 versus right now we're just starting to see 360s and 370s and stuff drop in Final Fantasy. But these trinkets do things like when I equip it, I can, increase the power of things. And I actually do have a jewel slot there that I just got this and I haven't put in, and that's kind of my materia. And so without getting too distracted from where I think I was headed, this is where you get into your casual, your rated. The Battleground system overall is very, very well fleshed out in World of Warcraft, as opposed to it's an identity that Final Fantasy is still establishing. They're just starting to have kind of move towards big events and things like that. But we have different battlegrounds, we have arenas. Arenas, I believe, are 2s, 3s, and 5s, as opposed to over here where you're talking about the feast, which is going to be kind of moving into your kind of 2 4-player parties is kind of the biggest. So you're looking at your 1s, 2s, and 4s, if I remember correctly. I really I personally don't get big on PvP in Final Fantasy. It just feels very different to me. They actually simplify all your abilities down, so it is very, very different. And then you have Battlegrounds, which typically in World of Warcraft are going to be one team versus one team, and they're going to range between kind of, I think, 10 people all the way up to as much as like 40 people when you think about things like Alterac Valley. And in Final Fantasy, you actually have front lines, which can even get you up to these much, much bigger, like 24v24 v24. And so you end up with very, very large parties, very large scale. They have rival wings. So these games just have a drastically different portfolio when you're comparing PvP, but it is something that's in both games. And so when you see Arena versus Feast, BG versus Frontlines, there are a lot of translations and kind of, you know, relationships you can compare there. And both games are easy to pick up. Both games have a form of level sync. That's very recent in World of Warcraft that they just added level scaling. It actually takes place out in the world. You can complete zones in any order you want, and you can jump in with friends. And when I queue on a low-level character, this character would queue at, say, level 50 and my friend would queue at level 40, we both actually get to keep our full set of abilities and things like that. And that is the way world level scaling works, as opposed to level sync in Final Fantasy, where if I go queue for a dungeon here, it will actually push me down to the set level, and I will have the abilities of a person in the set level. So that dungeon takes on a lot, not quite, of the same difficulties and the same kind of relationships with the boss pulls and all that it always did, even if they added abilities to that class after that level. Now, this is just meant to be a rough guide. It's incredibly top surface level. I have probably done a disservice equally to both games by simplifying them down to the point where I can try to draw parallels and connect those two. I see a lot of people take a break from one game from time to time, especially because they have alternating publish schedules on those expansions. This year we're getting BFA, Battle for Azeroth in World of Warcraft. Next year we'll get something at the end of Stormblood, our current expansion. And so there are times that it's nice to take a break. Both games have a similar level of trial. Their trials, in my opinion, do disservice to both games. And both games actually are incredibly fun. They're about the same amount of money to get into. They're about the same amount of money to play monthly. They have a lot of similarities if you're just looking to take a break from one. So I would love to know down in the comments section below kind of things that maybe I oversimplified and you want to expand on, or other comparisons that you've seen, or a system that you know of and you wonder if maybe there is something equivalent. I'll do my best to answer. I'm sure everybody else is going to do the same, and you're all going to be wonderfully respectful down there. These are two very different communities built on games that are trying to meet a lot of the same things. You've seen in this series a lot of other videos where I say, okay, both games needed to add flying mounts at some point, and they both dealt with that differently. Both games need a duty finder. They both did that differently. And so both of these games have solved a lot of the same problems, but they haven't always come to the same conclusion. And so it's just a fascinating thing to get out there and listen to what somebody else has to say. I have a friend, Zach, that's kind of my equivalent of Brian in Final Fantasy for World of Warcraft. I've played with him for a lot of years. I've enjoyed raiding with him. I've enjoyed all these other things with him. And when I hear them both talk, I'm not entirely sure that they would even catch what each other are saying, because they are using a lot of different words to say pretty much the same thing, even if they have a different level of priority or a different level of emphasis on how it should be dealt with. And so I would love to know kind of what you guys think. Definitely let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name's Chris with Work to Game. Thank you for hanging out, and I'll see you next time. You guys ever wondered what's behind me? Let's go ahead and take a look. There's some Warhammer and gaming stuff. There's some German beer steins. There's a rainbow ball shooting out of his face unicorn, some Star Wars toys, some different architecture projects, some Work to Game mugs, one with a chocobo on it, some Jeeps, and then my face, and then the first skyscraper I worked on in my first job out of college. So, yeah.